In this video, we will be exploring the first section of a discourse written by the 19th century Danish Christian philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who is well known for giving new meaning to the terms anxiety, faith, the absurd, and despair. The discourse we will be focusing on, Be Satisfied with Being Human, was first published along with several other discourses under the title Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits. Be Satisfied with Being Human was one of the few that were recently selected to be organized into a larger collection containing more of Kierkegaard's spiritual writings. In Be Satisfied with Being Human, Kierkegaard guides the reader toward what he views as the true meaning of the message from the Gospel of Matthew that instructs us to consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. By the end of this presentation, hopefully we'll have learned what there is to gain by considering the lilies. But first, we'll see who, according to the author, this message is mainly geared toward. The discourse begins with the exhortation to consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, two entities which, in this context, are intended to serve as teachers, according to Kierkegaard. These teachers, appointed by the gospel, are addressing not the healthy or the strong or the happy, he claims, but mainly the anxious, and they do so by honoring anxiety in the anxious person through silence. For instance, the lily does not, as he says, compare its prosperity with anybody else's poverty, in the same way that the bird doesn't compare his easy flight with the heavy trudge of those weighed down with anxiety. For it is comparison itself, he insists, that the anxious are under the influence of, and what inevitably causes them to become anxiously desirous of being different in some way. The anxious, writes Kierkegaard, are perhaps also tempted to impatience, and do not want to hear what others have to say about comfort and hope, especially when their grief has penetrated more deeply or for longer into their soul. For they think the happy do not understand them, and when those who are strong offer comfort, they seem precisely to place themselves far above them by doing so, while what other anxiety sufferers have to offer only depresses them further. For it is from speaking that all misunderstanding arises, which can be more precisely explained by noting that all speaking, especially speaking in company, implies an element of comparison. So when the happy person says, "Cheer up," to someone who is suffering from anxiety, this also implies, "Be as happy as I am." And when the strong person says, "Be strong," then he is understood as meaning, "In the same way I am." On the other hand, the lilies simply exist, and, of course, don't speak or compare themselves with those who are in their presence, where one may potentially find the silent acceptance that honors anxiety. Here, it seems to be apparent why the gospel solemnly commands the anxious to consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet, I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Consider them, Kierkegaard says. That is, observe them closely. This, he warns, is not a mere suggestion, but a serious invitation. There are, Kierkegaard writes, perhaps many who live in the big cities and never see the lilies, and many who live in the country and indifferently pass them by every day. The lilies of the field. Essentially, he urges that one shall not make it their objective to find the rarest or the prettiest plant, but instead seek for what he refers to as the abandoned, numerous, brocaded multitude, each as good as the other, or what one would consider to be the ordinary lilies. Now, it isn't my intention to steal away the honor and privilege of the lily being a divinely appointed teacher. Yet, I presume one does not necessarily have to have a field of lilies nearby to go to in order to learn the lesson that they have to offer. The important point, I think, is that one goes out into nature, in general, and takes the time to observe and admire how even the seemingly forgotten, ordinary plant is valued and cared for by, dare I say it, a higher power. But if this video has proven to be of any use, then perhaps going outside to inspect even the nearest blade of grass won't be necessary for the time being. How they grow. The lilies we are talking about do not receive any help from a gardener out in the field or somewhere out in nature where it seems, as Kierkegaard points out, that no one cares for them, and yet they grow. The lilies neither toil nor spin, and yet without doing anything to deserve it, they are adorned. Yet, I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. A closer look, he ensures, will reveal the loveliness and ingenuity of the lily's appearance and formation. Among the lilies, the anxious person is merely a human being, and content with being human. For it is exactly in the same sense that the lily is a lily, in exactly that same sense that we are human, and it is in the same sense that without working or spinning, the lily is more beautiful than Solomon's glory, that, without working or spinning or doing anything to deserve it, a human being is more glorious than Solomon's glory. So, concludes the author, those burdened by anxiety have this to learn from the lily: to be content with being human, and not to become anxious about the differences between one human being and another. Thus, in considering the lilies, one may begin to see that his or her worth as a human being is ordained long before any anxious thoughts about having to prove it to others or oneself imprison the mind. And after realizing that what is true of their worth is also true of everyone else's, far from giving in to conceit, that individual, I presume, would be inclined to humility. Above all else, hopefully it gives them a reason, at least momentarily, to be satisfied with being human.